Our next last guest of this morning worked with big tech, embraces AI, but is very critical about the role of big tech in AI. So let's give the floor to Bart de Witte. Bart, please come on stage. He's the CEO and founder of Hippo AI. And he will talk about open AI. Yeah. The floor is yours.
Dankjewel, Maria. Goedemorgen. Ik praat ook Nederlands, spijtig genoeg de tweede Belg op stage voor jullie. I'm going to switch to English. If I see my slides, that would be great. Who of you goes to digital art fairs? Nobody. I advise you to do so, because what digital artists do is they create an empathic relation with the future. And that's what I'm going to these art fairs for, because these artists are able to change your mind. And this is an image of Roy Ikeda, a Japanese artist. And when I saw that image, I thought about, well, perhaps digitalization can create inequalities. Perhaps digitalization can emphasize the inequalities in health. And that's what keeping driving me. I've been working for big tech, and I've changed my whole career, and I became a non-profit founder. No, I didn't do a startup and was hunting for money. Non-profit is really hard, because I truly believe that AI should be open and free for everyone to access. And when you start this journey and you start talking about open source, you're doing actually what Herco said yesterday when I was invited in a policy workshop from the Ministry of Health, that we need to rethink healthcare. We need to reinvent healthcare. And that's what I've been doing. Because everybody was talking about interoperability 20 years, and no data was flowing. It's like, well, you can have an interoperable horse, and it can still move into another kingdom or not. But if healthcare is some sort of Game of Thrones, then interoperability is not going to change. You need to look further. And I became an open source advocate, entrepreneur, and I try to move this or bring this into the healthcare realms. I've been called a communist. I've been called a dreamer. I've been called a romantist. But open source is not about giving you free access to end devices. But open source allows you to build your own products in your local cultural context. And I think that's truly important. So it's kind of like I'm a Belgian and we love our local beers. It's about or drinking Heineken in the whole world or drinking local beers and allowing people to do so. A disclaimer, open source in AI is complicated. We have data, we have code, we have weight files. I'm not going to go in the differentiation of this today because we have no time. My foundation has a mission. We try to accelerate, and it's named after Hippocrates. Why Hippocrates? Because in the original oath of Hippocrates was a sentence written that physicians were not allowed to sell or economize their knowledge. It was an open source mandate in the Hippocrates Foundation. And I started a community. We are 2,000 people worldwide trying to set up projects. It's really hard. It's really experimental to learn this. But I will now start with my story. I brought 4 acts and a conclusion. And I start with the last 12 months because it has been extremely exciting for me to see that what I started 5 years is becoming reality. I don't know how many people are familiar with the movie Man in Black. And remember this scene. This was the Orient Belt, and there was the galaxy that was in the bracelet of that cat. And it was strapped within that. And that's how I felt last year when I installed a large language model on my phone of 3 gigabytes and could access to all the knowledge that that language model was trained on being completely offline. I could ask for recipes, I could ask for translations, I could even ask for medical questions. Yes, I also got hallucinations. It's not perfect, it's a first start. But it was like having the internet without being connected to the internet, and also without surveillance. And it gave me the feeling, the same feeling as when I first connected to the internet and got access to all that information, and I got the complete freedom. And I think this is completely a game changer. We have suddenly a tool where we can ask, being completely offline, We can give it patient information by not having to worry about patient security and privacy. And it gives you answers. Yes, these phones are still small or slow, and we're going to get into no processors. The second thing that was amazing in the last 12 months is that open source caught up with closed source. Now there is this oxymoron company called OpenAI, which has nothing to do with open. And we started to catch up with them. And the red line is the evolution of the closed source and the performance on benchmarks. The green line is what open source did. And what you can see is that these two lines are going towards each other, and we are hunting them. Open source is always behind. Linux came after Unix was an operating system. But it's based on collaboration, and it's freely accessible to all. And I'm a huge fan of Clayton Christensen, former Harvard business professor on innovation, and he talked about disruption. And he said, well, disruption is something like you first have a 1 megapixel camera, nobody buys it, but as soon as you have 5 megapixel cameras, you kind of go to a customer demand, and suddenly the analog cameras were out of the market. And that's actually what happened now with open source. We have open source alternative to closed source, and it's disrupting the closed source business model of big tech. It is not based on data monetization, it's not based on IP, it's based on collective ownership and collaboration. And the same thing, the good news, it's happening in healthcare as well. We have large language models similar to Google MedPalm, and now since 2 weeks, there is a large language model based on Llama for Meta that is overperforming on Google MedPalms too. And that's incredibly promising. So we have open source AI, we have the possibility to build and brew our own beer in our local context. And it's like a library, a public library where we used to have our knowledge in books, and we could access these books without having to pay for access or without having to talk to lawyers. And I think this is the biggest transformation power we have. We have access to free resources, and then you have human imagination and human collaboration to reinvent healthcare. And this is a necessary resource. So it's 1-0 for the humans, human collaboration won against that unicorn or a few of these unicorns that try to monopolize AI in that sense. But when I started the journey, I started to look back, what are we doing when we digitize? And I started to look in sociology, and there was a German sociologist called Amin Nasehi. And he said, digitalization is nothing else as the duplication of the world through data. And that got me thinking, because yeah, we're always looking at a singular problem, so we duplicate a weather system so we can predict the weather, so that's a digital problem that we're trying to solve. And we're doing this with simulations. This is that COVID bastard virus that kept us busy, so we try to simulate it so we can learn and see how we can influence it. Or in this case, this was the collection of the whole proteome that was released by AlphaFold as a database, as a duplication of all our proteins in the human body as a digital database. And recently, there was the crystal structure of molecules that we can now predict with AlphaFold 3, and we can even predict and duplicate nature in that sense that we can predict how DNA molecules bind on these proteins, and that is accelerating drug discovery. But then there are some weird things happening as well when we talk about duplication. I'm a Belgian, I told you already. And somebody took the data of a deceased prime minister within the political party and brought our former prime minister back to life.
U ziet het goed. The beast is back.
When I saw this, I said, like, whoa, these are the governments that are warning us that deepfakes are going to kill democracy, and political parties are using that tool in order to get votes. Ethically questionable. And this comes to the point that when we digitize and duplicate the world through data, we need to ask ourselves questions. Because our identity, as Luciano Florido from Oxford University said, is not only solely my biological identity, it's my informational identity. So me is me plus my digital information. So when it comes about ownership, I see it all in the data should be owned by me, but the AI models that are trained on my data should be owned by myself. And then I came to philosophy and started to look into Jürgen Habermas, which is a German philosopher, who kind of predicted what we are seeing today, that our communication, our online communication is now being controlled by policies and by platform owners, and our public sphere, our public discourse is now being controlled and steered by these forces. And he predicted that when you shift things from the public sphere to the private sphere, that you change things. And in that private sphere, you have terms and conditions. You don't have human rights. So when we duplicate our world through data in our healthcare systems, we need to ask ourselves, which duplication do we need? Because if we talk about healthcare, and I'm sorry for my US colleagues, I worked for a large US company, and I was quite a lot in the US, but we don't share the same values and norms and principles when it comes to healthcare. We are, and I heard it many times today and yesterday, we are having built a system based on solidarity. And solidarity means to collaborate. We don't compete on certain things because our healthcare systems are a fundamental right. So when we duplicate a system and an AI system and a business model that comes from Silicon Valley, we have the risk of transforming our systems into something different. And as you probably already saw, I'm a kind of a sci-fi freak, and I looked at Altered Carbon on Netflix, and it was a dystopian series in the future. You can fly with cars, you can plug out your consciousness, put it into other bodies. It's the absolute digital freak show. And then there was this scene where suddenly the protagonist has his girlfriend bleeding to death and needs to go to the hospital. He brings her through the emergency room, needs to identify her, puts the hand on a scanner, and then suddenly she has no access. He can fly with a car, but then the surgery is performed by robots. Now, if the surgery is performed by robots, these are just algorithms and things that are cheap. Why is access not guaranteed? Well, because they duplicated their current healthcare systems, their current norms, their current principles, and we duplicated a business model that is similar and will duplicate the inequalities as well. And there is this risk that this will happen. So who owns the future is the question we need to ask. And I started to look then in economics to understand, because everybody talks about data is the new oil and it's the gold, but no, it's not. Data are becoming financial assets. They're becoming capitalized. And it's the elephant in the room that Maria was asking, what do you think about data? Who should own it? Well, we need to raise these questions, and in order to raise these questions, we need to understand the differences between commodities and intangible assets in that sense. Because commodities, they are being exchanged here, and the value is derived from exchange and is connected to supply and demand. But intangible and private intangible assets are working very differently. And I give you an example. There was a startup that had over 2 million patient records in oncology that was 4 years old, had nearly no revenues, but similar to WhatsApp, to Facebook, that startup got sold, or sold for $2.1 billion to a large pharmaceutical company. So you see that these data troves that were collected are valuable and are being transferred into the private sphere. And what Jennifer Hinkle here said is this price is based on the future projections of earnings. And I've had profit and loss statements at IBM when I was working there, and it's important to understand this. Because if you go to private intangible assets, the price of the, this is commodity, sorry, the title is wrong, of commodity, the price will probably decrease when the demand goes up and the supply goes up. But with these private intangible assets, this is working very differently. If there's a high demand and you have something monopolized and exclusive, most probably the price will go up. And then you can end up in a situation where the robot surgery is not accessible. And we know this. Insulin in the US was an intangible or private intangible asset. In the last 2 decades in the US, the price went up by 1,200%. The patent for insulin was sold 100 years ago for $1 because the inventor for synthesization of insulin said, it belongs to humanity. Nobody would have thought that 100,000 of diabetics, of which 50% would die of not having access to insulin in one of the most wealthiest countries in the world. That's what private intangible assets do. So if we do that with data and AI, I guarantee you that in 10 to 20 years, we will have that robot that refuses surgery in that sense. And all you scientists know this, because if you want to access research papers, I know there are some Dutch companies as publishers, it brings you quite some profits and taxes, or taxes on profits. But if you live in the global south, you cannot even publish anymore because you cannot pay for the publishing fees or cannot even access, and you need to go on a hacked website called SciHub to get access to knowledge. This is not what I think the global scientific community should look like. So I'm proposing a third one, which is the public intangible assets, which are assets protected by also means of IP, but the IP is an open source license that tells you that data can only be used if the derivatives of that data are also protected, so everything belongs to everybody. There is no border. I live in Berlin. It took us quite a while to break the wall there. And the difference between Eastern Berlin and Western Berlin was 2.5 years of life expectancy difference between the Western and the Eastern population. A wall was killing people. And I don't think we should do this with data as well. Is this naive? No, it's not. On my search and my research, I found out that when we did the Human Genome Project, I never thought I was going to show this guy, but we created policies to not allow that the human genome can be privatized. And
we all
Tony Blair
share a duty to ensure that the common property of the human genome is used freely for the common good of the whole human race.
So Tony Blair and Bill Clinton on the other side of the Atlantic said, the human genome is a common good. When I hear now Ursula von der Leyen talking about we have the billion-dollar data strategy for healthcare, I said, what happened between Tony Blair and Ursula? It's total madness if we think that we need to monetize data and we need to start building these assets. And people then think, is this communism? No. I said, it's like open sourcing the recipe of bread. Suddenly you have millions of bakeries in the world instead of 3 big bread companies where the taste of bread would be awful. You need to open these things, and there are papers out there that show that open sourcing the human genome brought $1 trillion of economical value creation in the US. So how do we do this, open source? Because there are no incentives. And I came then to the conclusion that we need some regenerative approach. It's a fancy word, I know. So when we duplicate the world through data, I started to build my own models and say, well, if we do that and we shift that data from private spheres, public spheres to private spheres, and we cannot get access to that data, we are shifting social value to economical value. And then perhaps over time, we cannot regenerate that social value except through tax redistribution. So how do we keep these things balanced? And how do we get access to data that is on the wearables, on the digital health apps? Because I don't think that company that was sold for 2.1 billion open sources their data. So I came to the conclusion that we need regenerative systems which are based on open source principles. So we have a certain form of data solidarity that creates a common layer that makes healthcare knowledge a common infrastructure between the industry and the public healthcare systems. So we can all tap into that and share. It's not a naive dream to have. And we will, in that regenerative framework, start benchmarking companies based on their regenerativeness. So if somebody's familiar with ESG scoring, we can score these companies that are not sharing as being have negative impact on social values. So we stand between these 2 worlds. Are we going to go for darkness and control of knowledge, or are we going to liberate ourselves? So I said before, the last 2 years have been extremely amazing because open source really broke through. And how do you start an open source movement? How do you create collaboration between humans? I heard somebody telling me many, many times, you need incentives, you need to pay them money. I said, no, there are other ways of means of collaboration. For example, if Death Star would threaten to destroy the world, I don't doubt that the Chinese, the US, the Americans, and the Russians and the Europeans would collaborate. If you have a joint enemy, you collaborate. And we had that joint enemy during COVID. During COVID, Dead Star was COVID. And there are so many papers out there that open data, open access publishing, open sourcing models really saved lives and accelerated innovation. The only reason why we got so fast an mRNA vaccine on the market, or vaccines, is because of openness. And so in the AI space, everybody knows this person. So when I was attending an event in Munich, he asked us the question,
how many of you would like us to open source GPT-6 the day we finish training it?
Everybody raised their hand.
Wow. Well, we're not going to do that.
And if you say that, you become Darth Vader. And when you become Darth Vader, you create a lot of people who are going to challenge that person and say, like, we're going to unite. And that's actually what happened. Like, we started to unite because there was hardly, the initial paper for transformer models was open access. And the most research was done on the lower level, which were closed source private models, intangible assets. On the open source layer, there was not much happening. And you saw then during the last few years that, especially from 2020, there was most of the magic was happening in that closed source world. But at the moment they published a paper for GPT-4 and didn't disclose anything anymore, people got upset. And people united. And people saw Darth Vader, and that's what happened. The top layer is open source collaboration. And that was the liftoff of a whole new race for openness. I've never seen something like it. It really started to cross-pollinate and people started to collaborate. The first project was Bloom, a big science versus big tech. And the paper has 4 pages, initial pages, with only names of authors that collaborated worldwide to build something that is accessible to all. Meta joined, which was called the Linux movement of AI. Meta, the company that was killing our privacy, suddenly joined open source. They accelerated the whole movement. And it led to open source AI being accessible because a big tech company is not really interested in running a model on your phone that is disconnected from the cloud. That's not their business model. So if you want to democratize, you want small models. And that's what happened. These models became really, really small. And if you then see the difference here, GPT-4 and Llama 3, which just came out 4 weeks ago, is 36 times, GPT-4 is 36 times more expensive as in running an open source model on a different infrastructure. 37 times cheaper. Now, what do we need in healthcare? I think we need to be scarce with our resources. These communities started growing, and what you saw is that when somebody publishes a model, other people copy it and fine-tune that on their own personal or other data. And we are now at a stage where 6 minutes after somebody publishing a model, somebody else publishes a copy of that model trained, fine-tuned on their data. 6 minutes. Imagine we can do this in healthcare, how fast we will build life-saving innovations. So we saw incremental innovation. Incremental means little steps, little baby steps, people sharing. And if a model is downloaded 2 million times, and 1% of that does something innovative, this thing will move on. It starts with big and it goes small. And suddenly you had a European champion that was challenging OpenAI after 10 months with 50 employees, betting with the open source movement, or working with the open source movement, and is now a valuated company of $7 billion. And it works on open source. There are business models of doing so. Suddenly we have our European platform providers that are embedded within our European values and work in our local social cultural context. A few weeks ago, Llama 3 came out, and Llama 3, in only 3 weeks' time, created a medical language model, or somebody created a medical language model that is now overperforming on MedPalm. And Lucia yesterday said something about the journey of life and collecting all your data as a patient. Now, somebody used that open source model from Llama and created a 1 million token context window. That means that you can enter in a prompt as much data as all your patient data from one single patient. And I believe this is going to continue. And perhaps in the future, these AI models can collect all the patient data of one single physician, replace databases, export PDFs as a bill, and replace software. Quite provocative. But this is, I think, where the future will go to, in that sense. So it democratizes. I run no single large language model more from the cloud anymore. It is on my laptop or on my phone. I don't use any cloud services. And as I mentioned before, they are all super, super small. And for example, small is beautiful. This is based on Llama 3, and it won on a benchmark test to do what we call creating a medical summary out of a long clinical note. And it does that better than any proprietary model. And it's a model that you can install on your phone. It's open source. You can fine-tune it then on Dutch language as a researcher or as an entrepreneur and build tools for it. It's the free resources. Daily, 2 million models are being downloaded in that open source community. In total, 1.3 billion models have been downloaded. If you contrast that to the COVID data donation app, which was in Germany, where all patients donated their data during a global pandemic, where 120,000 citizens shared their data and only 4 researchers got access and published 1 paper after 1 year, I think we need to do this differently. We need to open that data for everyone and not gatekeeping. We don't have to stand on the shoulders of lawyers. We don't have to stand on the shoulders of paywalls. We need to stand on the shoulders of these giants in the community. So my conclusion, and this is a message to all of you, if we don't build these models based on all the data that we have available and do this, our children will ask us why it took us so long to finally unite the data, build these models, make them publicly accessible so we can accelerate innovation and reimagine healthcare, as we all are sitting here and discussing. So I hope I inspired you in an open mindset. I know the Dutch are one of the most open cultures in Europe. So I hope that from here you will start collaborating and lead that open source movement in the medical space. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bart. Please stay on stage, Bart. I'm a little bit puzzled. I like open AI. I like open source. But how do we keep it safe?
Yeah.
Security is very important.
Yeah.
And you heard Alain Labrique and standardization, and I love it on my fingertip or in my pocket to go somewhere in Saudi Arabia, for instance, or in India and do my healthcare. But how do I keep my data safe in an open system?
Data is safe, like safety and open source. Let me answer just safety and open source. We are in Holland. In Holland, there was a company that created an encryption model to encrypt the communication between secret services, police, ambulances, and everything else. It was called Tetra Communications. It had a closed source encryption model. After 30 years, a group of Dutch scientists found out that there was a deliberate backdoor programmed in that encryption model. So somebody was listening for 30 years in all that communication, and nobody could see it because it was closed source. To think that closed source is safer.
Oh, I don't say that.
No. But to think that closed source, because that's what you always hear, open source is dangerous because somebody can create a bioterroristic weapon. That's absolutely nonsense. We'd had that discussion for 30 years. Open means millions of eyes can look on that code and optimize it. Now, to come on your question in terms of how do you balance the bottom-up development and the top-down regulations, at the end, these tools become parts and building blocks of a medical application. And for medical applications, you need certifications. So it will be regulated at some sense. But look at open source as giving the beer brewers the means of brewing their beer, and look at the medical regulations, the laws that define how you can sell beer. But we need that shared layer. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. But I want to know if there are other questions from the room. Yeah,
There.
upstairs. So I do my walk again. There. Can you give it, please, to her? I don't throw it because he already was almost broken.
Hello, thank you. I'm Anne. I'm very inspired by your presentation. I was wondering, because it's all nice to hear that, but then on the work floor, if it goes so fast, I'm getting a little bit stressy. I mean, how can you implement, or how can you implement those data on the workplace? How do you see that?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So I think there are two views. As a patient, you want things to go as fast as possible in order to save your life if we want to do medical innovation. So from a patient perspective, you want things to be as fast as we saw. But then from a provider perspective, how do you select the low-hanging fruits and how do you implement that? So what we are doing is we are building our co-pilot project that listens into patient-physician conversations for transcription. But the difference, what we're going to do is we're going to make the AI models only available local. So the patient voice is never going to the cloud. We have 100% privacy and control. And we are using these technologies to augment the patient-physician experience and reduce the documentation effort. And we don't have to pay licenses to a big tech company. We are not dependent. We're completely sovereign in doing this. And that's what it's about. We give innovators and startups and companies tools without having to use an API that creates new dependencies and perhaps information asymmetries.
And think also about CK, what she told about the marketplace, where you can find the things you really need at the workspace. You can have help from other people who know what's on the market. Other questions?
Here, in front.
I see here in the front, and I see one in the back, and that's what we're gonna do, and then we end, because you need some coffee and water and other things.
Thanks. So the Gartner marketplace, would it be suitable for OpenAI solutions as you propose?
Let me, having worked a long time for the industry, with a total respect to Gartner because we worked with them, Gartner is working together with larger industry players. We are not talking about putting models to a market. We are talking about creating a library, which is a public library that allows people to read and build their own things. A marketplace is for end products. It's for medical certified products or certified AI services. That's not what we do in open source. What we do is we liberate the resources, the building blocks, so you can recreate a new tool without any dependency.
So I asked CK something about a marketplace because I thought, oh.
So quick clarification here. Gartner does not own a marketplace. What we do is we study and we write about and we help to build all the marketplaces globally.
So
good that we had that clarification.
Yeah, that's a clarification. And here was the last question for this morning. Raymond ter Bocht, zie ik.
Dat klopt. Hallo.
Ik hou wel vast.
Hi Raymond.
Raymond ter Bocht, Chief Technologist, HDA-BNL. Dus we zijn bezig met secundaire data. My question in English is, if this progresses in this revolutionary pace, then in essence what you're saying is that regulatory will transform as well. What do you need to be regulated if it proceeds this fast?
Thank you for that question. I spent 6 months of my life last year in trying to influence the AI Act, the Regulatory Act, because some forces were trying to kill the open source movement. They said, no, we're not going to kill it. But what they were trying is that everyone who publishes a model is going to be liable for dual use of that model, then nobody's going to publish anymore. So the regulations are luckily open for open source, but I have difficulties with regulations. I go back to the example of beer. I like that example. I live in Germany. If you look at the top 10 companies in the world, none of the top 10 companies is a German company in beer brewing. Number 1 is InBev, which is a Belgian company. Number 2 is Heineken. And you know why that is the case? Because the Germans had the strongest regulations on brewing beer since 1450. They were not allowed to be creative and create new taste. There was a rule, and the rule was for safety purposes. So I think when we regulate, we also need to question, like, if we slow down innovation and by that kill people because that innovation is not accessible, we need to balance regulation with allowing that innovation to happen. So I'm much more pro-freedom and openness as that strong regulations. But that's a whole box of Pandora that I'm opening here saying this.
We will open that box, of course. Thank you, Bart.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Bart.